So hello, everyone. We'll go ahead and get started. So good morning or good afternoon, good evening to everyone, and welcome to today's webinar from the Global Partnership for Education on 21st Century Skills, how do national education systems work to foster them, and what is the role for GPE? As we get started today, we would like to share with you three important housekeeping details. So number one, for participants who wish to follow today's webinar in French, the Kudo platform will allow you to do so by clicking on the floor icon at the bottom left of your screen and then selecting French. Donc, pour nos participants qui souhaitent suivre notre webinaire en français aujourd'hui, la plateforme Kudo vous permet de le faire.
Again, the instructions are to click on the floor icon, which is at the bottom left of your screen, and then you can select the French channel.
We kindly request for all of our participants today, with the exception of our 4 speakers, of course, to kindly mute themselves and also to turn off their video for the entirety of the webinar by clicking on the microphone, mute, mic off, and video buttons on the bottom of your screen. If you wish to submit any questions or comments for the speakers, we invite you to click on the messaging icon, which you see at the top right of your screen, and then select the Participants tab therein. My colleague Saranat and I will be keeping an eye on the questions and comments that we receive throughout the session, and we'll try to respond to as many of them as possible during the Q&A portion. And then finally, number 3, you should have all received, as part of the webinar connection information that was shared yesterday, a link to a folder that contains the 3 presentations from the main speakers for today's session in French and in English. And following this webinar, we will also send you the recording of the session. So no need to worry about that. So now that we've covered those housekeeping details, please allow me to start by introducing myself. My name is Ramya Vivekanandan, and I'm a senior education specialist at the GPE Secretariat, where I work on learning assessment issues and coordinate GPE's Assessment for Learning initiative. At GPE, I've led the publication of our report, 21st Century Skills, What Potential Role for the Global Partnership for Education, which is really what spurred the organization of today's webinar. So now we published this report in January of this year, which now seems like a lifetime ago. Obviously, the world has been turned upside down since then, as we find ourselves in the middle of a global pandemic. So while we're not going to talk explicitly today about COVID-19, it may well be that the so-called 21st century skills, which some people prefer to refer to by other terms, such as transversal or transferable skills, soft skills, non-cognitive skills, etc. So skills such as creativity and innovation, problem solving, collaboration, and ICT literacy are perhaps more important than ever in the challenging circumstances of today. So I will start this webinar by making a presentation focused on GPE's landscape review. And after this, we'll be hearing from our 2 other main speakers for today, who I'd like to briefly introduce before we get started. So we have with us Dr. Esther Kerr. Esther is a senior fellow with the Brookings Institution in Washington, D.C., leading global projects which explore the integration of 21st century skills into education policy and practice, including coordinating the Optimizing Assessment for All, or OAA, initiative. She is also a professorial fellow at the University of Melbourne in Australia, and she's connecting today from Melbourne. And in her previous work, Esther served as the research lead for the Assessment and Teaching of 21st Century Skills, or ATC 21S project. We also have with us today Victor Stanislas Mukumba, who is the Principal Curriculum Specialist for Social Sciences at the Curriculum Development Center in the Ministry of General Education in Zambia, which is one of GPE's partner countries. Victor also leads the National Technical Committee, which develops standards of practice for the teaching profession in Zambia. He has also been involved in the OAA project led by Esther and her team at Brookings. So after our three presentations, we will also have the opportunity to hear from Maggie Koziol in regard to perspectives from the private sector on how they view the role of national education systems in fostering 21st century skills. Maggie is a senior manager for corporate citizenship at Deloitte, working on issues of education, skills development, and employment. Prior to this particular role, she was a leader in Deloitte's Public Policy and Government Relations Office. And previously, she spent many years working with the World Bank, UNDP, and USAID. So now, without further ado, we will start with our first presentation, and I will share my screen. Okay, so hopefully everybody can see the screen, and I think you are also probably seeing me, my face. So as I mentioned, so this first presentation is really focused on GPE's Landscape Review Report on 21st Century Skills, which, as I mentioned, was published in January of this year. The presentation will essentially share the findings of the review and hopefully spur conversation and some good discussion on the opportunities that GPE sees for itself in this regard. So, so here's the plan for the presentation. So after explaining the background and the context in which this work was undertaken, we will focus the rest of the presentation essentially on presenting the different parts, the different sections of the landscape review. So it had four components to it. First, a literature review and a scan of different frameworks and initiatives in regard to 21st century skills, followed by a stock take of education sector plans and GPE grant documents for a sample of partner countries. There were also mini studies which were undertaken focusing on the assessment of these skills in selected countries. And then finally, a review of efforts by different GPE partners, which then leads to the key findings and future opportunities that GPE sees for itself as presented in the report. And by the way, you should all have also received in the folder to which you received the link last night, the actual report is also there. So you can have a look at that when you have time. So starting first really with the context for the landscape review. In 2017, GPE launched a global initiative called Assessment for Learning, or A4L. And this initiative was launched because strengthening of national learning assessment systems is really a key part of the GPE model, which is seen to contribute both to improving learning outcomes as well as to more effective and efficient education systems, which are two key goals for GPE in its current strategic plan. So in a number of our partner countries, actually almost 80% of our currently active implementation grants, we are funding and supporting various initiatives around learning assessment. But A4L, in fact, is a complement to that. It's a global initiative that aims to strengthen national learning assessment systems and also crucially to promote a more holistic measurement of learning. So here you have the three components of the A4L initiative, including a diagnostic toolkit that we published last year, support to the regional assessment networks, NECMAP and Talent, which are active in the Asia Pacific and Sub-Saharan Africa regions, and finally work on the measurement of 21st century skills. So this landscape review is a part of that effort, looking at 21st century skills. And the goal of the review really was to spur some reflection in terms of what role GPE can play in the space in the future. And it's in fact not focused just on measurement issues, but more on 21st century skills as a whole in education systems. So interestingly, prior to the A4L initiative, GPE as such has had really limited engagement with the issue of 21st century skills. So improving learning outcomes is front and center, as I mentioned, in the current strategic plan of GPE, which is known as GPE 2020. But we haven't explicitly had a position in terms of what we mean by learning or what learning outcomes need to improve. We have an indicator in our results framework that looks at whether countries have made positive and statistically significant improvements in learning scores over time. And the methodology for this indicator allows for scores from a range of subjects to be used. But in practice, it's only really looking at mathematics and reading, because these are the subjects in which most of our partner countries actually tend to have learning outcomes data, as you can all imagine. And even in those areas, very few countries actually have scores, learning assessment data that is comparable over time. So this is a challenge more generally, but indeed, sort of by default, the whole conversation around learning has really been around the more foundational areas. But we recognize that increasingly our partner countries are concerned about 21st century skills or their equivalent within their education systems. And so the goal was to really kind of take stock of all of this, step back and think about what role there could be for GPE in this space. So as I mentioned, these are the 4 components of the review. So to start, we should also put forth exactly what we mean when we're talking about 21st century skills here. So like I mentioned, and as you all know, there are different terms that are used to refer to these skills. But we are essentially using the following definition from Binkley and colleagues from 2012, which speak of 21st century skills as abilities and attributes that can be taught or learned in order to enhance ways of thinking, learning, working, and living in the world. So here in the slide, we have listed the types of skills that are included in this definition and which we used for the purposes of this review. But there are skills like creativity and innovation, critical thinking, problem solving, decision making, information literacy, citizenship, local and global, etc. So in turning then to the first component of the report, which is the literature review, we really began by looking at the SDG 4, the Sustainable Development Goal 4, or Education 2030 agenda. So this is really, as you know, a lot of people have said, a new opportunity and a renewed sort of chance to look at learning from a more holistic perspective. So SDG 4 espouses a broad view of the nature and purpose of education. Learning is front and center, with 5 of the goal's 7 targets that include indicators on learning and or skills. But also what SDG 4 presents us with is the notion that learning should not be just about literacy or numeracy. So here targets 4.4 and 4.7 are particularly interesting. Target 4.4 with its focus on skills around technical and vocational, skills for employment, decent jobs, and entrepreneurship. And then target 4.7, which is really looking at knowledge and skills around areas such as education for sustainable development, human rights, culture of peace, global citizenship, and other areas as well. So it was a really exciting moment, I think, in 2015 when this agenda was put forth. And it really gave us an opportunity to think about learning in a much broader sense. So we really kind of dug into this, into that actual SDG 4 framework as a frame of reference, as a starting point. But then we also looked at a number of different definitions and frameworks around this broad area of 21st century skills. And there are many, but just as a few examples here, the ATC 21S initiative, which I mentioned that Esther has been very involved in. Also frameworks such as the framework from the Partnership for 21st Century Learning, the 2012 Education for All Global Monitoring Report, which talked about the notion of foundational, transferable, and TVET skills, the CASEL framework coming out of the US, the UNESCO Bangkok Transversal Competencies Framework, the UNICEF Life Skills and Citizenship Education Framework in the Middle East and North Africa regions. So all of these have unique features for sure, but essentially they all encompass a similar array of domains and cross-cutting skills that fill those domains. And most of the skills that are referenced in the Binkley and colleagues' definition that we're using for our landscape review also are mentioned in these different frameworks, including creativity, innovation, problem solving, collaboration, etc. Also, as an interesting aside, and I think since the time that we published our report, the Harvard Graduate School of Education has actually put together a really helpful web page, bringing together, in fact, a number of these different definitions and frameworks around what they call, in fact, social and emotional learning, but which includes many of the frameworks shared here, as well as others. We also then dug a bit deeper, looking at specific initiatives that have been undertaken in regard to 21st century skills. And what's interesting here is that there is the more conceptual and definitional work, but a number of these initiatives also went a bit further as far as research, development of training materials, and the like. I might just note here the Learning Metrics Task Force, which was co-led by Brookings and the UNESCO Institute for Statistics, and of which GPE was an active member. Also, the work undertaken by Esther and her colleagues at Brookings, looking at skills for a changing world, which looked at, I believe, over 100 countries, looking at their different policy documents, mission statements, strategic plans, etc., to see how these skills are reflected. I think it's also interesting to look at the CASEL work, as well as the UNICEF Life Skills and Citizenship Education Initiative, because both of these in particular have advanced notions of a more systems approach to these skills. And so in the report, you have more information about all of these. It's also interesting, just quickly to note that different types of so-called 21st century skills are also increasingly found in different cross-national assessments, such as PISA, regional assessment programs in Southeast Asia, Latin America, et cetera. So from a large-scale cross-national assessment perspective, there are also many efforts underway to think about how to measure or capture these skills. So then, moving to the stock take. So essentially, so for those of you who are familiar with GPE, our bread and butter is really around supporting our partner countries. There are currently 68 GPE partner countries, supporting these countries to develop and implement education sector plans. So through this stock take, we really wanted to dig into these documents and to take stock of these countries' policy orientations in their sector plans, as well as the investments that GPE is making through our education sector program implementation grants, or SPIGs, to support the area of 21st century skills. So in this stock take, we looked at 15 partner countries, which were essentially in Africa and in Asia. And these were the same countries that participated also in the mini studies that I'll talk about in just a moment on assessment. And we essentially looked at, for these countries, how many of their sector plans reference 21st century skills, which skills, in fact, and in which part of their sector plan. And then how many of their GPE grants actually include support for activities defined as related to these skills. Are there any observable patterns in the sector plans, in the grant documents, and which aspects of education are seen as entry points to advancing these skills? So here you have a snapshot of the findings. First, in terms of looking at what types of skills are referenced in sector plans as well as in SPIGs, we see that most of the references that we found are actually in relation to ICT literacy specifically, followed by citizenship, and then what we call personal and social responsibility. But in fact, all of the skills that were captured in our framing definition are referred to in some respect across the 15 countries. But then what's interesting, when you look at the sector plans versus the GPE grant documents for these same 15 countries, while a number of, all of the 15 countries, in fact, made reference to these skills in their sector plans, whether in their vision and mission statements or program components, or policy priorities, rather. When you look at the SPIG grant program components, there is very little in terms of documented support. And it tends to be, again, on ICT literacy, citizenship, and personal responsibility. And in fact, there were only 3 countries out of the 15 where GPE, at least through the SPIG, was actually supporting concrete activities to support 21st century skills. So there's somewhat of a disconnect there. So yes, so essentially, countries clearly have prioritized this area. They have stated objectives in regards to 21st century skills, but only 3 countries, as I said, refer to them in their GPE grant documents. To the extent that they are focusing on this within the grant, they're in particular leveraging teacher training and pedagogy as the component through which this work would be delivered. So ultimately, the takeaway here seems to be that there does seem to be somewhat of a disconnect between vision and sort of more aspirational elements, and then the application of SPIG GPE grant funding specifically towards concrete implementation of those activities. Now, that doesn't mean that governments themselves or other partners are not funding that work, just that GPE funding is not used specifically for that purpose. So then turning to the mini studies on assessment of 21st century skills, I won't go into great detail on this because Esther will be coming in on some of this, and also because time is short. But we did want to undertake, as part of this landscape review, some primary research focused on at least one operational component of education. So it's A4L, so we focus specifically on assessment. And essentially, the team at Brookings coordinated these mini studies in the same 15 countries in Africa and Asia. And they were supported in doing so, coordinated by the NECMAP and talent networks run by UNESCO Bangkok and UNESCO Dakar, respectively. So the purpose of these studies is really to explore the degree to which 21st century skills are reflected, either directly or indirectly, in national and classroom level assessment tools of the sample countries, in which subjects, in which learning domains, and then really whether there's potential to adapt those tools to better integrate the skills. The study focused specifically on late primary grades 4 to 6, or early secondary education, grades 7 to 9, so depending on the country. So I'm just going to run through this really quickly, but essentially what the mini studies showed us is across the 2 regions, both in Asia and in Africa, the majority of the tools that were collected were not designed specifically to capture 21st century skills, or what are referred to as transversal competencies in the case of Asia. But what was quite promising is that there was really apt potential to capture some of these domains. So, that really kind of teaches us that we don't necessarily have to start from scratch when thinking about how to assess these skills, but rather we can look at some current assessment tasks in different subject areas and make some modifications such that, in addition to the subject matter that they're directly assessing content from, there's also potential to capture some of the 21st century skills as well. And then lastly, the last part of our landscape review, really a review of partner efforts. So as most of you probably know, GPE is not just the Secretariat based in Washington, D.C., but it's a partnership made of international organizations, donor partners, civil society organizations, foundations, and private sector, et cetera. So we spoke to a number of different GPE partners, including UNESCO, UNICEF, the World Bank, Oxfam, Education International, the Global Business Coalition for Education, Porticus, the Youth Employment Funders Group, and others, to really ascertain. So even if GPE as such, the Secretariat has not been active in regard to 21st century skills, what is the partnership writ large doing in this area? And the answer to that question is quite a lot. There's been a long history of work in some of these organizations of conceptual and framing work, work to develop curriculum and learning materials, training teachers, initiatives around assessment, and other areas as well. So here we have just a few examples from some of the partners that we spoke to. But in the report, particularly in the annex, you can find much more detail about these specific initiatives. So then kind of bringing all of this together, what does all of this mean for GPE, and what are our key findings, and what should we be doing in this area? So really, I mean, there's been a rich history of framing work and initiatives at the global level, many of which are not necessarily, in fact, focused on developing country partner context, but some which have also included a number of our partner countries. Our partner countries are most definitely prioritizing 21st century skills in their sector plans, but there seem to be some gaps in implementation, particularly at the system level. Assessment tools, as we saw through the mini studies, do have potential to capture some of these skills. And this is something that's quite promising and that we should continue to work on. And then finally, across the GPE partnership, there's been a lot of work around 21st century skills, but gaps really kind of more at the system level. So while interest and aspiration is there, and while there are some implementation, indications of implementation, often it tends to be focused on just one part of the system. So maybe just on teacher training or just on curriculum. There seems to be a lack of know-how, in fact, on what we mean by a system-wide implementation of a 21st century skills agenda in developing countries in particular. And there seem to be particular gaps in research, knowledge sharing, and capacity development and advocacy focused on this system-wide lens. So then that leads us to conclude that there may be some opportunities for GPE in this space. So like I said, it's quite a rich ecosystem, and we definitely don't want to sort of get involved in things that others may be doing and want to be very complementary with our efforts. But we see the publication of this landscape review report in and of itself and its dissemination, including this webinar, as being a way to signal that the GPE is interested in the issue of 21st century skills. And we're ready to support our partner countries in their aspirations in that regard. So on the one hand, we see that we could be doing much more around global policy dialogue and advocacy in regard to these skills. On the other, in terms of encouraging research on what it means to translate these aspirations into practice and what it means to integrate 21st century skills throughout an education system. And then finally, to support more global and regional work around capacity development, knowledge exchange, innovation, et cetera. So I think it's really about using the convening power of the partnership and the fact that we are, in fact, a partnership in order to bring together work around these particular areas, looking from a more system-wide perspective. So I will conclude there. You all have access to the publication, and this is also the URL on our website where you can also download a copy. So I will stop sharing my screen and then invite Esther. Yeah, so Esther, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Ramya. And good day and good evening to everybody. As you can see, I'm all kitted up here. It's getting cooler in Australia at the moment, and I guess in many other parts of the world it's getting hotter. So I'll pick up straight away and go to my presentation, I hope. And application window. And I hope that what you can see right now is just a slide. So what I was wanting to talk to you about today is there were two main questions, really. One was, whether 21st century skills actually feature in education systems in developing countries as well as other countries in the world. And the second question was whether these sorts of skills can be measured. And the answer to both, in short, really is yes. I think we've known for some time that we can measure these skills at a technical level, but for us, particularly in the Optimising Assessment for All project, the question was, can we measure them at classroom level? Can we implement in the classroom? And so some of the work that I will go through today is really trying to get at that particular point.
Esther,
yeah.
I'm so sorry to interrupt you. We actually don't see your
You don't?
slide. Yeah.
Interesting. What will I do? I'll close that and I'll see if moving this over here helps. Is that any better?
Nope.
Okay. Application window.
There we go. It's coming up.
Yeah, and is that in slide view or not?
Not.
Okay. How about now?
Yep. Perfect.
Great. Thank you very much. Good. Okay, so it's not as though anybody really missed anything with that first slide. So that was my startup. Thanks, Ramya. So in terms of optimising assessment for all, we basically assembled groups of educators in countries, as Ramya mentioned before, from Asia and Africa, and identified just a core group of skills to see whether we could start looking at how can we assess these in the classroom. And what happened as part of these projects is that we facilitated the development of classroom assessment tasks and then tried to work out, can they work in the classroom? Because it's one thing to put a whole lot of assessment tools together. It's quite another thing to see whether they work in the classroom, whether they're administrable, whether they're useful for teachers and so on. And what we wanted to ensure is that the work we did would be generalisable. So we were not interested a priori in just developing sets of tools. We were interested in looking at, can we identify a method and an approach that can be generalised by the countries that we were working with, and then in the longer term by other countries. So that's the context for the work. Very briefly, I'll just go back through a little bit of background, and some of you will have seen these before. One of the first questions was this one about, are 21st century skills really being adopted worldwide? And the answer to that is there is no doubt that there's some consensus about broadening our education system so that we have more of a whole child perspective, really, on education. And what you can see in this slide is the graphic that's been put together by the OECD. And I find it particularly useful because, notwithstanding the fact that we all have very different definitions and understandings of all of these things, as Ramya mentioned before, 21st century skills, transferable skills and so on, this particular graphic makes it clear that the competencies that we're looking for, the ones where we're adaptive to our circumstances, they're a combination of the knowledge, the skills and the attitudes and values that we bring to our daily lives. And so all of the 21st century skills we talk about are parts of this overall perspective. Now, Ramya also mentioned the fact that Brookings some time ago under Skills for a Changing World had done a study where we looked at over 160 countries, and we were wanting to find out whether 21st century skills were included in the mission and values of education statements, whether we could see skills actually integrated into curriculum. And lastly, we wanted to find out whether there was a deeper approach in the sense of there being skills or learning progressions around the 21st century skills. And over 70% of the countries, of those 160 countries, did include some aspirations for 21st century skills. And they're the ones that are in the sort of the pale pink in this particular graphic. There were somewhat fewer countries where you could see when you looked at the curriculum that the skills were integrated and they actually permeated subject areas. And there were very few countries, only 13 in fact, that had really more comprehensively worked out skills progressions. And it's really at that skills progression level that you want to get, because if you want to teach these sorts of competencies, then you need to know what they look like when they're basic. You need to know what they look like when they're more sophisticated. And so you sort of need that framework. So that was interesting at the point of saying, hey, yes, there's something going on here globally. Then we come to OAA, Optimising Assessment for All. And you can see here the countries to which Ramya referred earlier on, the Africa group and the Asia group. And all of the countries in there participated in the mini studies. And Ramya's already pretty much run us through that, so I won't spend time on it. The countries that are pinkish are the ones that participated in the more substantial OAA study over the last 2 years. Kenya participated a little bit in one, but was not a participant right through the Africa experience. So where the mini studies were designed to give us a little bit of a baseline, are there any assessments at either national level or in the classroom that are capturing 21st century skills? The main studies were designed to start designing approaches and tools that could be used in classrooms. So that's the context for the work that we were doing. These are just a couple of shots to try to make it more real to you. This is the Asia teams. So in each of the 3 countries in each of the regions, when we worked for the 2 years odd, we had national teams coming from each country. The national teams were typically populated by assessment experts from within the country, and they also had reasonably large teacher teams. And you can see in this particular shot, we have a lot of the Nepali teachers. And we needed them because not only do they understand a lot more about how classrooms function, but they could actually try a lot of the tasks out in their classrooms so that we could identify, hey, are these tasks doing what we intend for them to do? And then if we look, and I should mention, here we have the NECMAP framework that Ramya may have referred to, I think, before. And this means that we had a sort of a base from which to start looking at the different skills that we were going to work with in the Asia area. And so this framework was developed out of UNESCO Bangkok by the AreaNet network, and then later on used and expanded by NECMAP. So that was a real advantage for the Asia work, because a lot of the people had done a great deal of work previously through NECMAP in the Asia region. And then here we have a shot from the Africa group, and this is taken from the Talent network and from their website. And here we were starting about 6 to 9 months after we'd already worked with Asia, which was actually a brilliant opportunity for us, because we learned a great deal from the Asia experience in terms of development of tasks, and the Africa area really, I think, benefited from that. And in particular, we really started following this, what I will call a template approach. So the idea being that we're not so much interested in putting out tools. What we are interested in is developing guidance so that teachers and their countries can start working on tasks themselves. So what you can see in this slide now is the 3 skills areas that we worked with, and the 3 different subject areas that we worked with over the 2 geographic areas. And you can see there are some differences in terms of where the different regions focus their efforts. So what had to happen in terms of OAA was that the 3 countries in each region needed to agree on the subject areas that we were going to work with, and they needed to agree on the particular 21st century skills that we would focus on. And you can see what there is from that. There were some, I don't know, fairly significant differences between the way we worked across the 2 regions. And so with Asia, we did quite a lot of curriculum audit activity so that we could make sure that the curricula that we were working with in each of our 3 countries was similar enough for us to base tasks in, the idea being that those tasks would be administered across all 3 countries. When we worked in Africa, we did not require that. So we didn't do the same curriculum audit, but at the same time, and maybe Victor might talk about this next, at the same time, all of the countries worked together through the process of designing tasks and ensuring that their children would be able to actually access the tasks in terms of the knowledge that lay underneath them. So with all of our development of tasks, the idea is that we would apply the tasks, or I should say children would apply the tasks through the content of the subject areas. So what we're interested in is not trying to teach tasks in a vacuum, but we're trying to look at how would you apply these skills, because we're looking at whether you can work beyond, whether you can generalize, whether you can transfer, that being the whole point. And at the bottom here, you can see just one example of a template for a task. And here it just describes some of the basic processes for what was, in this case, a mathematics task. And over here, you can see the particular problem-solving skills that were part of it. So for both Asia and Africa, we did a great deal of work in the beginning on identifying what the definitions and descriptions of the skills were, and then looking at the structure of those skills. So in identifying what the components or the sub-skills were. And then when we designed tasks, we were designing those in a way to target particular sub-skills within the overall skills areas. So it was a fairly technical approach, but one that was easily accessible, both by the teams as we worked through and by the teachers. So that was one step. And, you know, for the last 2 years, we've really spent most of our time on that part of the process. However, the more important part of the process is, where do you take it? And this is trying to make this point that this is just one step in the process of trying to integrate 21st century skills into our education systems. And for that to happen, we need to get all the different parts of a system aligned. So we need to have the skills integrated into the curriculum. We need to ensure that our teaching methods and our teacher skills are such that they can work with and model the skills. And we need to make sure that we've got assessment tasks that target the skills in ways that are meaningful. And so if we look at all of these little dot points that link to each of these, there's quite a lot of work that needs to be undertaken and understood. And so here I already spoke before about auditing curriculum. If you're going to apply skills to tasks or to subject areas, you need to make sure that you've identified particular topic areas, that the students will have had experience with those topic areas and so on. You need then to identify the skill opportunities, and then you integrate these. And one of the big challenges is, at what level do you target skills? So if we've never taught 21st century skills specifically or explicitly in classes before, how do we know at what level to target that for 8-year-olds or 12-year-olds or 16-year-olds? So there's many, many unknowns, many gaps, as Ramya mentioned before. when we look at the teaching, we need to look at what happens in a classroom, what's possible in a classroom. And last year I was involved in some work with UNICEF in the Philippines, and we did a great deal of work around what's actually happening in terms of classroom activities and what is the extent to which there is the opportunity to change teaching practices such that teachers can model the skills as well as actually integrate them into topic areas. And then when we look at the assessment piece, we need, or what we did particularly in OAA in Africa, is to look at a lot of those tasks that came out of the mini studies and think, how could we revision these? How could we slant them in a way that will capture the skills that are of interest? So that alignment of system and that very systematic approach was how we sort of went through OAA. Now we're, pretty much at the end of the project, and all of the countries are trying to deal with this idea about where do you go next? So if we've so far just looked at problem solving and critical thinking and collaboration, do you expand now to other skills? Or do you take the tasks that we have and use those in more classrooms to find out different ways that students respond to them? Lots of different approaches you can take to scaling. And so we have to think about who can make those decisions. We have politicians who are responsible at government level. We've got the policy makers who are both accountable and can set directions. We've got the experts like those that we've been working with in our national teams. And we've also got aid providers and groups like GPE who can help to spur some activity in this area. We're also very fortunate last year that NECMAP hosted a workshop in Manila for 14 countries around 21st century skills. And out of that workshop, many suggestions came about what are some of the ways that you can start moving toward the scaling. Once we know we can actually assess the skills, then what is the next step? Do we move first into the curricular area? Do we start doing more assessment activities? Do we go to the higher education sector? So many different choices. All of them have to be covered, but what is the sequence that you would take to get there? So you can see in this particular slide, these are some of the suggestions that came out of the plans that were put together by those 14 countries. And I've just highlighted the item templates just because I showed you one of those before. So lots of choices and decisions to be made. And I thought that just to indicate what actually seems to happen in many countries, I'd show you this slide. So as part of the UNICEF Philippines work that I did together with ACER, I looked at a number of different countries and looked at what they had been putting in place in terms of this issue around alignment across its system. And this is I've got to make it really clear, this is a qualitative, a subjective analysis of what's gone on from looking at the histories of these countries. And of course, what you can see there is I've got the pedagogical aspect, the curriculum, the assessment, and then looking at whether all of these are actually aligned. Has the country made an explicit and conscious attempt to make sure that they have got some consistency across the approaches? Now, what you see across all of these countries, of course, is that they go to curriculum reform first. And there's no doubt that that is what is happening in more countries than not. So a lot of countries spend a huge amount of time putting effort and research into curriculum reform. But if you don't accompany that with changes in pedagogy, and if you don't support it with innovation in assessment, how do we expect it actually to be implemented? Because merely changing the curriculum doesn't change what a child experiences in a classroom. And so it's a very interesting when I started looking across at all of these different countries to see where most of the effort has gone. So fascinating stuff there. Before I finish, I just want to alert you to another IEA study. Ram, you mentioned before a couple of others that have looked at different aspects of 21st century skills. And later this year, IEA is going to start up a new study that I'm going to lead, which is called 21CS MAP. And this is not an assessment study. It is looking much more deeply at that curricular side, because notwithstanding the fact that we know lots of countries have moved into the curriculum reform piece first, we don't know what the different approaches are to that integration with curriculum. We don't know whether it's interdisciplinary, whether it's cross-disciplinary, whether it's standalone, and we don't know what the implications are of those different approaches to integration of 21st century skills inside curriculum. So I'm very much looking forward to us getting into much more depth when we can get moving on the IEA study. And as again, Ram, you mentioned in the beginning, COVID, of course, has upset many plans. So we're somewhat later than we'd hoped to be. But I do hope that you'll keep your eyes on the IEA study and encourage your colleagues to have a look at what's going on there. And if you're in a country that might be interested in participating, that you will put up your hand and let us know. So thank you for your attention. It's been a little bit strange not being able to see anybody as I talk, but I hope that you found it interesting, and I look forward to hearing some questions from you. So I'll hand over now to Rania.
Thank you. Thank you, Esther, very much. And thanks for sticking to the time as well. So can I now invite Victor Mukumba to share your screen, to turn on your video, unmute yourself and share your screen. And please use a headset if you weren't already. Hi, Victor. Hello. If you have your headset, can you kindly use a headset, because we're getting a lot of background noise.
I am actually using a headset. Are you able to hear?
Oh, you are. Yes, it's okay. There's just a bit of background noise. So if need be, my colleague might turn off the video. That might help. Can you share your screen for the presentation?
Yes, that's what I'm trying to do right now.
Okay.
Hello?
Yes.
Yeah, what it is indicating for me is that the site does not support screen sharing. I don't know what I need to do with that now.
Would you like me to run the presentation for you? Would that be easier? And you can tell me when to click forward?
Okay.
Okay, Victor, can you see the presentation?
So at least it has now appeared.
Okay, so you can go ahead. Just tell me when I should click to advance to the next slide.
Hello?
Yes, the floor is yours. You can start.
Could we move to the next slide?
Yes.
Hello?
Yes. Go ahead, Victor.
Hello?
Yes, please continue.
Hello, are you able to hear me?
Yes, Victor, we can hear you just fine. You should be able to see the third slide with the presentation outline.
Okay. Yes, basically I'll be able to run through an introduction, give a bit of a background, and the provisions in the policy and legislation, and also just take a look at the curriculum, and then also provide what opportunities we have had in this country, and then what we actually plan to do, and then conclude. Can I have the next slide?
Yes.
So with the introduction, we have had a lot of movement towards the integration of our 21st century skills in our education system. And that is clearly visible in the legislation and the number of our national policy documents, and also in the revised curriculum framework that we have. Now, while it's actually quite evident in those documents, the legislation, the policies, it is actually less evident in the assessments that we have at national and even at school level, and even in the teaching at classroom level. Could I have the next slide?
Yes.
So, in terms of our background, at the time of independence in 1964, we basically had an educational system that actually emphasized the use of the acquisition of subject knowledge using traditional teaching approaches. So any issue of skills or values being acquired, that was basically inadvertently inculcated. But when we look at the other policies that came in, the Education Act of 1966, together with policy reforms that followed, there was now a little more emphasis on practical subjects in the schools. And the curriculum also, at this particular time, also emphasized the issue of teaching, survival, and communication skills. The next slide. Hello, could I have the next slide?
Yes, it's there.
The next.
The next.
Actually, the next, yes. So when we look at provisions in the national policy, if you look at the excerpt that is actually there, or you have moved too far ahead.
Sorry, here you are.
I need to have the other ones before this. Okay, thank you very much. So when you look at the excerpt that we actually have here, there was a lot of emphasis on some of the skills that you can see here, although here we were basically referring to them as life skills. Decision making, problem solving, creative thinking, critical thinking, effective communication, interpersonal relationships. So all these were actually embedded in our national education policy of 1996. Can move. Hello?
Yes, we have moved.
Now, okay, thank you very much. Now, the other issue is that in order to be able to try and see how these skills can be embedded or entrenched in our educational system, we have developed continuing professional development framework. Now, this is a policy document that states how this would be used as an important tool for enhancing the quality of education by basically building competences of teachers, teacher educators, and education leaders. Because we all are aware that in this ever-changing educational landscape, we required a different set of skills in order to be able to effectively teach. Now, what we have done with this CPD framework, it actually makes participation in continuing professional development mandatory, and it actually attracts credit points for you to be later on given a practicing certificate as a teacher. Can move.
Okay, I moved. There's a 2-second delay, just for your information.
Okay. And then another important document that we put in place was the standards of practice for the teaching profession. Because this country has been reforming and restructuring the education system to try and respond to the changes in the educational landscape and also the societal needs. So one latest addition to this whole reform structure was the development of the standards of practice for the teaching profession. Now, these actually spell out the issues relating to the work of teachers, the teacher educators, and educational leaders, because we would like to have certain learning outcomes from our learners. So these teachers should be able to manifest certain distinctive competences and skills. And that's why these standards of practice for the teaching profession actually clearly outlines what competences, what skills and knowledge levels that the teacher educators and educational leaders should actually have. So basically, what you can see are the purpose and the use of these standards that we developed. So one important element that can be looked at, apart from all these that have been outlined, is the assessing teachers' pedagogical content knowledge and skills, and also that these standards form the basis for performance management. So those are critical aspects that are there. So in the standards, it clearly spells out what teachers' competences should be, the knowledge levels, and also the skills that they actually need to have. The other functions are basically the idea that these standards can also guide the development of training programs in institutions that train teachers. And then we have different agencies that look at the interests of the teachers, like the Teaching Council of Zambia, which deals with registration of teachers and also the issue of issuance of practicing certificate. We also have the Teaching Service Commission, which deals with the employment of teachers. So these teaching service agencies need to have consensus on the kind of teacher they would like to have. At the same time, these standards actually operationalize our Teaching Profession Act that we have in place. So even in the legislation, we actually have the specifications on what is actually needed. So specifications like the curriculum needs to be able to have issues of knowledge, skills, values, and attitudes, which learners are expected to have at the end of each the end of the course. So these are actually embedded in the act that we are actually currently following. Can move to the next slide. Our curriculum identifies 6 critical competencies, or what we would term the 21st century skills, that our learners need to have. And these competencies are those that we have outlined there: critical thinking and problem solving, creativity and innovation, entrepreneurship, self-management, communication, and cooperation. These are what are actually outlined in the curriculum. But one other element that we have come up with is that now in 15 schools, we are beginning to provide what is termed the STEM education. It's science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. This actually education, maybe we can move to the next slide. It will be able to bring out the issues a bit more clearly. So within the 15 schools, we are trying to see how whatever the children learn in their subjects, they're able to deal with a practical application of whatever knowledge that is actually gained. So in the process, they'll be able to acquire the required skills. Now, in order to look at what skills these that we actually envision, the next slide will be able to bring out what skills we were talking about from a scientific viewpoint. Now, when you look at these ones, we had organized them as acquisitive, organizational, creative, and manipulative skills. When you look at what was presented earlier by both Ramya and Esther, you have issues like problem solving. Now, to get to an issue of problem solving, these skills, that scientific skills we have outlined here, basically could form, in some cases, sub skills of the main skill, like problem solving. Because in problem solving, you'll be able to have all these issues of inquiring, searching, investigating, gathering, and so on, and eventually formulating hypotheses. So these are basically sub-skills in the main skills that would be there. So our STEM curriculum emphasizes the acquisition of these skills for every learner that will be able to pass through. We've started this with 15 schools, and all the teachers, head teachers, and even deputy head teachers in these 15 schools have actually been oriented on how to be able to ensure that these skills are actually inculcated in our learners. Now, as a country, we have had a number of opportunities that have presented themselves in order to help us entrench the 21st century skills in our educational system. So we have had, for example, lesson study, which actually put a, and then we have had optimizing assessment for all, the issues that Esther brought out, with a lot of emphasis on the assessment and acquisition of transversal skills. Now, in order to inculcate these transversal skills, it actually requires a distinctive pedagogical approach in the classroom setup. And then when we look at our lesson study program, we can move to the next slide. Something that was started in 2005 as a project by JICA and the Ministry of which is actually basically school-based continuing professional development, which is a peer-to-peer collaborative learning practice that helps to deepen the teacher's capacity and skills. And of course, it's premised on the constructivist theory of learning, which encourages the learner-centered instruction. Those 8 stages are what have been used in the lesson study program, in the problem or challenge that teachers have in
Victor? Victor, we can't hear you. Victor, are you there? Okay, it seems that we have lost Victor. Must be a connection issue. Okay, so if we get Victor back, then hopefully we would have a chance to get back and hear the end of his presentation. But since we are running a little bit behind schedule in terms of our time, I thought I might go ahead and invite our colleague Maggie from Deloitte to share. I think she has a few slides, but more generally some perspectives from the private sector in terms of 21st century skills and the role of education in that regard. So Maggie can go ahead and feel free to share your screen if need be.
Okay, can you all hear me?
Yes, thank you.
Great. Good morning, everyone. Thank you to the presenters for sharing your research and knowledge, and thank you to GP for inviting me to provide some of my own thoughts this morning. I'll try and go quickly since our time is short here. I want to start off by talking a little bit about my own firm's motivations when we think about skills. For us, this is a belief that locally and globally, we need a diverse workforce and an inclusive culture that supports a productive and prosperous society. At Deloitte US, I lead our program called Pathways. This is our effort to help build bridges between education, skills training, and employment. Through Pathways, Deloitte connects and works with nonprofit organizations, community groups, businesses, and others to help individuals and communities uncover pathways to prosperity, employment, and economic and social mobility. And really, ultimately, here in the US, our efforts are aimed at accelerating US workers' access to education and skills training needed to succeed in today and tomorrow's marketplace, while also bolstering our own commitment and resources to drive positive, equitable change and inclusive prosperity in our communities. Now, before I get into more concrete discussion around 21st century skills, I really just want to touch briefly on the reality we're all living in right now in this global pandemic. Arguably, things were stark before the pandemic, but in the world of COVID-19, inequalities in education, work, training, healthcare access are simply untenable. So as we think through soft skills attainment, through education systems alignment, and the implied need for assessment, I ask that we all think through where we are today and what our world could look like 6 or 12 months from now, especially for those most acutely affected by this crisis. And now I'm certain that I'm not the only one who's kept it up at night thinking about this. And without a doubt, the pandemic is affecting the way that Deloitte works and the way that we're approaching our own work. It's also influencing how we think about our work in the social impact space and skills and workforce development. So our journey around skills and workforce development at Deloitte really gained a lot of steam the last few years, starting with the work that we did with the Global Business Coalition for Education, which resulted in our Youth Skills Report. The report serves as a call to action for business leaders to engage in efforts to bridge the growing skills gap and provides both a skills framework and recommendations for businesses to implement. It includes an extensive discussion around categories of skills businesses deem essential for success in the future of work, which I'll try to quickly outline here. So building on foundational skills of literacy and numeracy and aligning with the literature and conversations on the issue, we frame skills into 4 categories. With the majority of business executives uncertain that they have the right workforce and skill sets needed for the future, our categories provide a frame to prepare people for a future in which jobs and required skills will change, and in which agility and continuous learning provide a foundation for growth. We start with workforce readiness, which of course has long been a cornerstone of traditional education systems and development programs, instilling foundational skills like time management, personal presentation, attendance. These basic skills are our first step on the path to employability. Second, we focus on what we call essential human skills or soft skills, what we've been talking about today, 21st century skills, creativity, complex problem solving, relationship building, communication, emotional intelligence, critical thinking, and recognizing, of course, our growing technological interconnectedness, the expansion of global markets, mobility, migration, diversity of workplaces. There is a growing emphasis on the idea of global competence, the ability to apply these acquired soft skills in a cross-cultural, multicultural, and global context. So a common thread across these soft skills, social emotional learning competencies and global competencies that are decidedly human, and in the world of the future of work, really irreplaceable by machines, which is very important. Third, as we enter or are in the 4th Industrial Revolution, this will likely mean the creation of new employment opportunities, a renewed focus on jobs with employment shortages. These will likely require technical skills and targeted training. So unlike the previous 2 skill areas, here industry-specific demands and requirements and inputs from industries themselves are important. We argue that these inputs can create opportunities for industry-driven demand analysis, work-based learning, talent need projections to redefine the education to training and employment pipeline. And finally, we talk about entrepreneurship. So due to innovations in work, microloans, co-working spaces, though those may be a thing of the past, global interconnectivity, platforms to cover benefits previously tied to centralized employment, we believe entrepreneurship will likely provide a unique opportunity for people across the globe to bypass barriers to entry into traditional employment. So these 4 skill categories together can provide a foundation for lifelong learning and the skills needed, for the future of work. What we ask the questions of what roles can individuals, businesses, governments, the nonprofit sector play in developing these skills for the future of our changing workforce, which is part of what we've been talking about today. And we're at Deloitte trying to address some of these questions through our own practices, as well as our efforts focused on social impact. So what is Deloitte doing and what can business do in this context? I'll quickly walk through the recommendations that we outlined in the report and give examples of how Deloitte is activating efforts to create pathways to prosperity through skills training and workforce development efforts. So first, our first recommendation focuses on aligning stakeholders' objectives and efforts. So for Deloitte, we work with organizations like GBC Ed and the National Skills Coalition, networks of broad-based stakeholders and businesses to amplify our own efforts, to align our own thinking, and to really try and achieve greater scale in our efforts. Next, we're engaging public policy. So with other CEOs, Deloitte signed on to, here in the United States, what's known as the Pledge for the American Worker. And with that pledge, we're committing to training or upskilling 75,000 individuals over the next 5 years. Third, developing promising talent strategies. So with our own HR, with our own talent structure, we're thinking about how do we expand recruitment efforts to new and more diverse talent pools. We're thinking about how to develop pipelines into our businesses through organizations we're working with on the social impact side of things. Through our human capital practice, we're serving clients with our full breadth of human capital, public sector, and future work experiences and resources. And finally, we're investing strategically in workforce training approaches. Here in the United States, we work with organizations like Europe, Braven, and the Goodwill, supporting programs that focus on opportunity youth populations, long-term unemployed, veterans, using best practice training and job placement. So that's just really a tiny snapshot of what we're doing. And I'll just say that I spent the majority of my career working for multilateral and bilateral organizations in the public sector. And I moved into the private sector because I believe that business can and should play a unique role in a responsible society. And certainly business has much to gain by investing efforts that focus on skills, especially soft skills that align certainly for a professional services firm for our business needs. I applaud the efforts that GPE and others are undertaking and considering in the context of 21st century skills, and look forward to continuing being involved in the efforts as they evolve. I'll stop here. I look forward to the discussion. I hope I didn't take too much time. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Maggie. So we are coming to the end of our session, but we luckily do have still a few minutes left over for some questions and answers. Very unfortunately, as you all would have seen, Victor actually lost his connection, and I don't think he's managed to come back. There were a few questions that were addressed to him specifically, but what we will offer to do is to convey those to him by email, and then when we send to all of you a link to the recording of this session, we can also include his responses along with that so that he would have an opportunity to address those questions. So there's a few other questions that we've gotten, some of which are general and some of which I think are perhaps best addressed by Esther, though Maggie, of course, you're also welcome to weigh in. So some questions and some comments, I should say. So one highlights the need for curriculum planning and assessment to be a basis for pedagogy and teacher training, and that the skills need to be integral to the curriculum. So it's really speaking to the issues of alignment, which I think Esther in particular focused on, as well as Victor, and which I think from GPE's perspective is really sort of the gap that we see in this area as far as 21st century skills integration. So while a number of countries have done some interesting work around developing curriculum, developing textbooks and manuals that focus on other types of materials that focus on some of these skills, whereas other countries might have done some teacher training, for example, around some of the areas. There's very few examples, at least that I'm aware of, particularly in the context of our partner countries, where we've sort of approached this on all fronts. And so this is really the gap that our landscape review has revealed. So there's a few questions I think that maybe would be interesting to hear from Esther. So one general comment around the common language around each of these skills, and the fact that kids and students, learners at different stage of their development might be sort of at different progressions in terms of developing those skills. So I think it sort of makes an allusion to some of the learning progressions work that you've been doing and that you highlighted a bit of in your presentation. So it'd be great if you could say a bit more about that. There's also a comment in terms of the curriculum audits and integration that you referred to, saying that the focus on curriculum audit and integration also means that some things need to drop to ensure that competencies can be integrated into subject areas so that we don't have an overcrowded curriculum. So I guess it's in fact a question, noting that without this, a clear link to student performance standards and then assessment tasks and items, we wouldn't be able to know how learners grow and progress, which then influences teacher pedagogy and teaching and learning experiences. So maybe I will just sort of stop there and give Esther the floor to respond on some of those points.
Thanks, Ramya. Yes. So I'll start. I think it was John was asking some questions, and one was around this issue that if we do audits a curriculum, we try to integrate the skills within subject areas. Does that imply that we need to drop parts of curricula? If you already have an ideal curriculum, well, I don't think you could have an ideal curriculum if you actually have not already integrated the skills. But let's just say you're operating from the curriculum that you have. Ideally, no, you would not need to drop anything, because what you would do is rely on a different pedagogical approach. So if we think of a difference between a teaching and learning environment where the teacher acts merely as a transmission device versus a teacher teaching, modelling the skills, for example, presenting problems for students to solve. So really encouraging an exploratory approach to learning, as opposed to accepting a learning and teaching environment where information is just given and learned. So one of the things, however, we find in many curricula worldwide is that many curricula are very, they've got a whole lot of stuff in them. I can't think of really good words for it right now. And they need to be decongested, basically. And so what we saw, I think particularly Kenya was one country, that when they reformed their curriculum in the early years, they did take out a lot of the redundancy. And that then did give the time for the curriculum to be taught in a way where skills were being developed at the same time as the knowledge was being developed. So I think that, ideally it would come down to a pedagogical approach that would mean, no, it's not a matter of taking things out of the curriculum. It's a matter of teaching in a different way so that immediately students are practicing the skills as part of their accumulation of learning. And so it's really more like a deep learning approach. So at least that's my view. There might be other ways of looking at this particular issue. The other big question, I think, and that's that one around learning progressions. And again, a couple of you have asked this question or posed this issue in a couple of different ways. If we don't know what is reasonable to expect of a student in terms of demonstration of problem solving or collaboration, how can we know when they are achieving at a level that we would like to see? So we already know what we can reasonably expect in terms of numeracy acquisition or literacy acquisition. We don't know that with these other skills. So how do we deal with that problem? The sort of facile way of responding to it is to say, well, we need research. We need to be testing and teaching children right across the age spectrum so that we gather data, so that we understand what are typical ways of functioning in these areas. However, that will take a great deal of time, and it would be a wonderful thing, if there are people who want to fund that style of research. In the interim, what we found is that if we give some of the same tasks that include skills to students at different grade levels and see how they respond differently, we can start to build those progressions. And then it's a matter of trying to make sure that we can communicate or disseminate those differences so that together we can start building progressions. To me, it just has always seemed a great waste if just one country tries to do all that research, when we have so much work to do and it would be best shared across countries. And that's precisely what we've tried to do in OAA, of getting the countries to work together, because that means that we get so many different perspectives and we get more capacity in terms of pushing it. And I think although we didn't get to the end of Victor's presentation, I think you could see if you read through his presentation, they started off working with just, 12 or so teachers, and now they've expanded to over 100. So this idea of collaborating and working out, I think, is definitely a way to go. So I'll stop there just in case you want to come on in.
So Esther, there was a somewhat related question around, so sorry to put you back on the spot.
That's okay.
But specifically on so collecting data to populate the learning progressions. So the question was whether you can touch a bit more on the importance of looking at curriculum and skills development with an age and also gender lens. So in terms of the learning progressions.
Absolutely. I'll go to the age, because I think that's probably the easier one. And that goes back a little bit to what I was saying before, that I think at the moment, since we are dealing with a lack of understanding of what this progression is, that we need to rely a great deal on the teachers. And that is what we've done in OAA, where we've taken a subject level task that the teachers know the students can cope with, and then saturated that with a particular skill, whether it's critical thinking or collaboration. And then the teachers basically have a look at that and say whether they think the students can deal with it. We play around with it a little bit. We try it out on the students across a couple of different grade levels and then see how they have managed it. So I think it does need to be that iterative process where we try to draw on the expertise of the assessment experts, the teachers, and we collect the data from the students in the schools. So if any of you are interested, there's a couple of reports already up on the Brookings site that we've published out of OAA. And there'll be another one in about, 2 weeks' time that gives some worked examples of the ways that we've put some of the tasks together. But in particular, the last report that went up just a week or so ago out of Africa gives a couple of examples of that approach. So I think that from the age perspective, I think that we can do that iterative approach. In terms of gender, I guess it depends on whether we hypothesize that there are going to be gender differences across some of these skills and competencies. And in terms of ones like problem solving or critical thinking, I think a priori we'd hypothesize that there are probably no great differences. Where we go to some of the more social oriented 21st century skills, I think it's quite reasonable that we'd hypothesize that there will be differences. And the issue with that, again, is that we have to test it out. So if we give collaborative tasks to groups of girls, groups of boys, mixed groups, how do they differentially deal with that? And one of the difficulties for us at a research level is, what are the individual levels of competence anyway that tend to disguise what the gender differences might be? So once you start looking at those sorts of issues, it becomes a much bigger research project to try to work out the potential impact of gender, particularly for the social skills.
Great, thank you, Esther. So there was also a question, I think actually addressed more to GPE, around whether we, in terms of our perspectives, whether we are planning to support more work around teacher training. And the question was asked in French, but teacher training and also support and training for school leaders. So on this point, let me just say that in all GPE implementation grants, I believe in 100% of them, there are components specifically on teachers and teaching, not specifically in relation to 21st century skills, but as far as thematic areas, this is the area that GPE provides the most support for. So that includes, it depends on the country, but that includes support to teacher training institutions, support to in-service training, for the development of teacher training materials, So a broad range of different investments around support to teachers and also to school leaders. So this is definitely something that is a strong feature of the way that GPE works. Again, in terms of 21st century skills, specifically, at least in the SPIG grants that we looked at for those 15 countries, there were only 3 really that had some activity capturing some of these skills, and all of those were in fact in relation to teacher training. But what we're really advocating for in this space moving forward, like I've been saying, is really a more system-wide approach and system-wide perspective. And I think that sharing of knowledge and experience, as we're doing here today and hopefully beyond, is really, really important in order to shift us more in that direction. So then, as I mentioned, there were, since we're running out of time, there were some questions specifically addressed to Victor, just so that the participants are aware that we have noted them in relation to how Zambia is approaching integration of 21st century skills in early childhood education, as well as how competencies are embedded into subject areas, and a few other specific questions. So we'll be sure to relay those to Victor and to share his responses with all of you. But then maybe just to close, there was one much more general question, I would say, and I think this is from our friend Arjun from Bhutan, if it's the same Arjun that I'm guessing that it is, who asked us, and I invite Esther, Maggie to come in, should we be focusing on literacy and numeracy or 21st century skills? So from my perspective, and I won't say any more, but I really think that one of the reasons that we undertook this work, and I think why we're having this dialogue, is that we really need to shift from having this either or perspective. 21st century skills are not necessarily standalone areas, but they're part and parcel of all of the education experience, in terms of all of the subject matter, in terms of how we learn to read and do mathematics and do science. These are all opportunities to embed these skills. And I think that most of the successful examples that we've seen of countries approaching this have been taking that perspective. So I really hope that we sort of shift the mindset in regard to that. So if either Esther or Maggie just wants to come in on that, as far as just a closing perspective, then certainly that would be welcome.
I just say, Ramya, that I completely agree. I don't think that they can be decoupled. And there is certainly no call to leave literacy and numeracy behind. I think it's far more about how do you make certain that those soft skills, the 21st century skills, are also embedded in the curriculum and that those are also important. But I mean, the foundational skills of literacy and numeracy, I think, are foundational for a reason.
I don't think I can add any more. I agree. But I would also just like to address Arjun's other question about the measurement of 21st century skills at large scale through paper and pencil. And Arjun, maybe you'd like to email me about this and I can follow up with you. That would be a good way to go. One of the issues, of course, is to what degree can we measure these applied skills through paper and pencil? And obviously some of them we can, but I think some of them we can't. And within OAA, there's no doubt that we've had a great deal more difficulty measuring the social 21st century skills than we have with the cognitive. It doesn't mean that we can't do it, but there's no doubt that it's more challenging. Not only more challenging in terms of how you develop tasks, but more challenging for teachers to understand and to deal with, and for students to understand a fairly different approach to assessment. So Arjun, do email me if you'd like to follow up some more. Thanks.
Thank you both. So now we are 10 minutes beyond the time allotted for the session, so we're going to go ahead and close. So let me just take this opportunity to give a big thanks to our speakers, to Esther and Maggie and Victor, who unfortunately is not here right now. We're all dealing with some connectivity issues, I guess, and technical difficulties, as they say, but really glad that we were all able to make it. Thank you so much to all of the participants as well for all of the great questions and comments. And we really hope that we can keep this dialogue going and to continue engaging on this issue. Thank you also to my colleague Saranat, who was behind the scenes and helping with all of the technical issues. We will be in touch with everyone in sharing the recording of this webinar, as well as the responses from Victor. So with that, we will close and hope to see you at a future GPE webinar. Have a great day or evening, all of you.
Good.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Bye-bye.